and I think we had one more. Yes.
Stuart Cohn, Environment Canada, Vancouver. My question is about the iconic imagery, and I think it was Mr. Painter from the BBC that talked about that a little bit. I think there are different kinds of iconic imagery, and that's what presents both the challenge in communication, but also the opportunity. The catastrophe as an iconic image is an image of destruction, you know, the fires and the floods and so on. But the other iconic imagery that he mentions, the bear, it's not a dead bear that you're seeing. It's a live bear, and it's the bear that you want to save. And so the bear or the forest, those are icons that are supposed to represent a reason to act because you want to save it. And what I'm wondering is how, again, the good part of it is that talking about wanting to save something, you would think is representing a positive challenge. It's an ideal to strive for. And yet, that sounds like it's far too narrow an icon to use, because the bear, the polar bear, is not, you know, it's kind of exotic. It's not in your backyard. It may raise some things in your mind and will attract a certain group, but the hard-to-get folks, the denier folks, are not moved by that. So are there other kinds of iconic images that we want to save that ought to be added to this mix besides the ubiquitous polar bear as a counterpoint to showing the death and destruction and so on?
Okay, thanks. Then let's take those questions. Can we start with the problem of communicating the causes and the solutions? What can we actually do about it, and on a larger scale, not just by using energy-saving light bulbs? Otwin Ren, is that one for you?
Well, I totally agree that it's much more easier to communicate about what's happening in climate change because that's not very contested. As soon as you come to solutions, you have a lot of contesting views about it, and you have blame. And that, of course, is an issue that is much more carefully drafted, because very often if you put blame on industry, you will have, of course, a big protest from industry and saying it's not us. If you blame the policymakers, it's not them, and so on and so on. So I think, in a sense, the media, as much as they like to put blame on something, if it's being transported by somebody else, they are a little bit careful because they don't want to appear ideological. And I think that's an important element of this. The second element, of course, is that if you convey the feeling that, you know, things are happening, and you don't convey the feeling that there is some agency, we get what we see in a lot of public surveys that people say, yes, it's a serious problem, but nobody can do anything about it. So that's a fatalism that we see also in many of the developing countries in surveys there, that people just feel there's nothing you can do about it, which of course is not the message you'd like to convey. So in a sense, I think you're right, but I think we need to be careful that in terms of solutions, it will always be plural and controversial. And actually, coming back to the second question that you raised, basically, is that most journalists really say, if I want to have one opinion, I want to have the opposite opinion, and I don't care about the distribution of opinions, because I cannot judge who is right. So he wants to have the other one. Well, as a matter of fact, some people actually call me and say, this is the message we want to convey. Would you confer that message? If not, we are not interested in your interview. And it's very clear they want to have a specific message because they have the other one already. And so the sense in solutions, you always have even more than two, and that makes it probably more difficult. On the other hand, that message then is not as unique, not as clear, not as unambiguous as the other one, and that's why everybody believes in climate change, but the people are not believing in the solutions.
Okay, James wanted to say something.
Different take, actually, as a practicing journalist. I think the essential problem on why isn't there more coverage of, you know, solutions, or if you like, positive examples of adaptation, is because there are many, we as journalists are not being told that there are, and I'm thinking particularly of solutions or adaptation in developing countries. We don't know enough about the positive examples that are going on And I constantly put out a plea to the scientists I know, and the social scientists in particular, that if you have positive stories of communities being able to adapt to the climate change that is already happening, we want to hear about them. Let me give you a very brief example. When the IPCC reports came out in 2007, I did a brief study of how TV covered them all the way in 6 different developing countries, and also the international media as well. The top line of that was that there was far more, something like 10 times more coverage of the impact report than there was on the mitigation report. And I can assure you, one of the reasons why that was the case was that when TV editors and other editors said, okay, how are we going to illustrate the adaptation report and the mitigation report, there was nothing like as much material out there to be able to show as all the very well-known pictures of the catastrophe. So it's almost like a plea from journalists. It's a practical problem. Please give us these, concrete examples of positive examples of adaptation. Finally, on balance, I think it's the role of serious journalists, and I don't just mean science journalists, I'm not a science journalist, is actually we have to weigh up where there is sufficient consensus on a piece of science and where there isn't. It is not actually driven by this sort of false balance. I think at the BBC we were a bit slow, and you're right insofar as the instincts of particularly an organisation like the BBC is to seek balance. And we were, I think, too slow to take off the air contrarians. But I do think, most serious journalists who are covering these issues, and it's almost sort of written down in the sort of BBC guidelines on climate change now, is that we are paid to try and find out by consulting with scientists, not to find a false balance, but to find out where there is scientific consensus and where there is not. And that is our role.
Okay, thank you. Richard Klein was next. Then I'd like to take a couple of the other questions.
I'll try and be brief because a lot of what I wanted to say has actually just been said by James. Yes, there is a consensus about climate science. It doesn't mean that we know everything, and it certainly doesn't mean that the message is that simple, that it's all because of humans. Of course, there are other factors as well, and they're well understood. I think, to get back to the question about having a fair debate, debate's always good. As an academic, I think that's how we make progress in our thinking. On the other hand, then let it be an academic debate. A debate between a climate scientist and somebody who's paid by an interest group who doesn't have any peer-reviewed articles on their name, then that's not a debate. And I think entering in a debate with these kind of people is actually giving them a credibility that they don't deserve. But having a debate about the solutions, I think that's really useful. Also because there are people who are experts about technology, about economics, who have different views. And that's also where there's much less of a consensus. I think the consensus on the urgency is there, but the consensus on how to actually act on the urgency is not necessarily there. I think that's a much more interesting debate also for the media, to be honest. The problem is there aren't that nice images to go with it necessarily. So I'll leave it at that then. Thanks.
Okay, then can we go with the iconic images? Do we need, well, yes, we need more icons. What do we need? How do you feel about that?